The Velkari research vessel, called Serenity's Grace, was dying in the cold darkness of space, and Ambassador Thireen knew that her crew had only hours left to live. She stood on the bridge of the crippled ship, her long bioluminescent tendrils flickering with fear and exhaustion, as she watched the damage reports scroll across the screens in front of her. And every single report brought worse news than the one before it. The attack had come without warning 3 days ago, when the Crixtal raiders had dropped out of faster-than-light travel and surrounded the peaceful research vessel before anyone could even think about running away. And the Crixtal were known across the galaxy as brutal hunters who captured other species and sold them as slaves in the dark markets of the Outer Rim. The Serenity's Grace was never designed for combat, because the Velkari were a peaceful species of scientists and artists who had not fought a war in over 10,000 years. So when the raiders had opened fire and demanded their surrender, Captain Voltas had tried to run instead of fight, and that decision had saved their lives, but destroyed their engines. Now the ship drifted helplessly in a region of space that no Galactic Council species had ever explored, and the Crixtal raiders had promised to return in 6 days to collect their prey once their own damaged ships were repaired. Ambassador, the young communications officer, called out with terror in his voice, "We have received another message from the raider fleet, and they say they are looking forward to adding Velkari slaves to their collection." Thireen felt her stomach twist with fear, because she knew what happened to species that fell into Crixtal hands. And she had seen the reports of broken minds and broken bodies that emerged from the slave markets years later, if they emerged at all. She looked around the bridge at her crew, at the 37 Velkari who had trusted her to keep them safe on this scientific mission to study ancient star formations, and she saw the same fear reflected in every single face that looked back at her. Captain Voltas floated closer to her with his own tendrils, dim with despair, as he spoke in a quiet voice that the crew could not hear, asking her what they should do now that their engines were destroyed and their weapons were nothing more than small defensive lasers that could barely scratch the paint on a raider ship. "We must send a distress signal on all frequencies," Thireen said with more confidence than she actually felt, "and we must hope that someone out there will hear us and come to help before the raiders return." The captain's tendrils flickered with surprise and then with worry as he reminded her that they were in uncharted space far from any council patrol routes, and that the only inhabited system anywhere near their location was the quarantine zone that the council had forbidden all species from approaching. Thireen knew exactly what he was talking about, because every species in the Galactic Council had been taught about Sector 7G from the moment they were old enough to understand fear. The sector contained a single inhabited world, called Earth, and the natives of that world were a species that the Council had been watching for over 500 years, without ever making contact, because the observation reports had terrified every diplomat and military commander who had ever read them. The species called themselves humans, and the Council had classified them with a single phrase that had never been applied to any other species in galactic history: Apex Persistence Predators. Thireen had studied the reports during her training as a diplomat, and she still remembered the horror she had felt when she learned how humans hunted their prey on their homeworld. They did not use ambush tactics like the Crixtal, or overwhelming numbers like the swarm species of the outer galaxies, but instead they simply followed their prey across any terrain and through any weather until the creature they were hunting collapsed from exhaustion and could run no more. The reports described humans chasing animals for days without stopping, their bodies designed to shed heat and maintain energy in ways that no other known species could match. And when their prey finally fell from exhaustion, the humans would simply walk up to it and kill it while it lay helpless on the ground. But that was not even the most terrifying part of the observation reports. The humans had somehow convinced wolves, one of the deadliest pack predators on their planet, to join them as hunting partners. And together they had conquered every ecosystem on their world, until no other species could challenge them. They rode on the backs of massive beasts, called horses, that they had bent to their will through generations of selective breeding. They had built weapons that could kill from great distances, and then they had turned those weapons on each other, in wars that lasted for years and killed millions of their own kind. The Council had decided long ago that humans were too dangerous to contact and too unpredictable to trust, so they had placed the entire sector under permanent quarantine and forbidden any ship from approaching within 10 light-years of the human homeworld. But now Thyrene stood on her dying ship, with raiders coming to enslave her crew, and she found herself thinking that maybe the terrifying humans of Sector 7G were exactly what she needed. "Send the distress signal," she ordered with her tendrils glowing bright with desperate hope. "Send it on every frequency, including the ones that broadcast toward the quarantine sector, and pray that someone answers before the Crixtal return." The communications officer hesitated for only a moment before his training took over, and his fingers began moving across the console, and within seconds, the voice of Ambassador Thyrene was streaming out into the void in every direction at the speed of light. "This is the Velkari research vessel Serenity's Grace, calling for emergency assistance," her recorded voice said across the darkness. "We have been attacked by Crixtal raiders, and our engines are destroyed, and we have wounded crew members and failing life support systems. So please, if anyone can hear this message, we desperately need your help." The message repeated again and again as the hours passed, and the crew tried to repair what they could while rationing their remaining air and food. And Ambassador Thyrene sat on the bridge, watching the stars through the viewport, and wondering if anyone would hear their cry. 72 hours after the signal was first sent, the sensors on the Serenity's Grace detected something that made the entire bridge crew freeze in terror. Dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of sensor range, and it was moving toward them at high speed with its weapons powered and ready for combat. "Is it the Crixtal?" Captain Volthos demanded, with his tendrils flashing panic colors. "Have they come back early to take us?" The sensor officer studied her screens with confusion on her face as she reported that the ship did not match any design in the Galactic Council database, and that its hull configuration and energy signatures were completely unknown to their computers. The ship was angular and painted black like the space around it, and its hull was covered with weapons that looked crude but powerful, and on the side of the vessel there was a painted image that made Thyrene's hearts stop beating for a full second. It was a white skull with crossed bones beneath it, and it was grinning. "They answered," Thyrene whispered, with her tendrils going completely dark with primal fear. "Humans actually answered our call." The black ship grew larger on their screens as it approached, and Ambassador Thyrene realized that she might have just traded one group of predators for something far more dangerous. But at least these predators had come when she called for help, and that had to mean something. Did it not? Commander Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge of the UEN Death's Hand and watched the crippled alien vessel grow larger on her main screen, and she felt the familiar excitement of the hunt beginning to pulse through her veins. She was a tall woman with dark hair cut short for combat efficiency, and a jagged scar ran down the left side of her face from a knife fight she had won 15 years ago in the slums of New Buenos Aires, and her eyes were the cold gray of a winter storm as she studied the damaged ship that had called for help. "Gunnery Sergeant Cole," she called without turning away from the screen, "what do you think happened to our new friends over there?" Marcus Cole walked up beside her with heavy footsteps that made the deck plates vibrate beneath his massive frame, and his cybernetic right arm whirred softly as he crossed his arms over his chest and studied the sensor data. He was the biggest man on the ship, at nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders like a cargo loader, and his dark skin was covered with scars and tattoos that told the story of 30 years of combat across 3 continents and now across the stars. "Looks like raider damage to me," he said in a voice like gravel rolling down a metal chute. "See those burn patterns on the hull, and the way the engine section is completely torn apart. And those are classic hit-and-run tactics used by pirates and slavers throughout the Outer Rim." Vasquez nodded, because she had seen the same thing and reached the same conclusion, and she felt her jaw tighten with anger, because she hated slavers more than almost anything else in the universe. Earth had joined the galactic community only 30 years ago, when a council survey ship had accidentally wandered too close to the solar system and been detected by human military satellites. And the first contact had been tense and frightening for both sides. The aliens had been terrified of humans because of that. All the observation reports they had gathered over the centuries. And humans had been shocked to discover that they were not alone in the universe, and that the galaxy was filled with species that considered them to be monsters. But humanity had proven to be adaptable as always. And within a decade, they had reverse-engineered faster-than-light travel, and begun expanding into the stars. And they had quickly discovered that the galaxy was not a peaceful place at all. Slaves and raiders and conquerors roamed the space between stars, preying on weaker species and taking what they wanted, because no one was strong enough to stop them. And the Galactic Council spent more time talking about the problems than actually doing anything to solve them. Humans had decided very quickly that they were not going to be victims, and they had built warships and trained soldiers, and made it very clear that anyone who threatened Earth or its allies would regret that decision for however long. Long they managed to survive. The distress signal from the Valkyrie vessel had reached Earth space 2 days ago, and Command had sent the Death's Hand to investigate, because Vasquez and her crew were specialists in exactly this kind of situation. "Get me a channel to that ship," Vasquez ordered, "and let them know that help has arrived." The communications officer opened a channel, and Vasquez spoke in a calm and professional voice that she had practiced many times, identifying herself as Commander Vasquez of the United Earth Navy, and asking permission to dock and render assistance. The response came quickly in a trembling voice that clearly belonged to someone who was very afraid, and the alien ambassador, named Thireen, welcomed them aboard and thanked them for answering their call. 20 minutes later, Vasquez led her response team through the airlock and onto the Valkyrie ship, and she had to fight to keep a smile off her face when she saw the aliens waiting for them. The Valkyrie were delicate beings about 4 feet tall, with long glowing tendrils instead of hair, and large dark eyes that took up most of their faces, and they looked like something that belonged in a children's story rather than on a starship. Ambassador Thireen stepped forward with obvious effort, because every instinct in her body was clearly screaming at her to run away. And Vasquez understood that reaction because she had seen it many times before. Humans smelled like predators because they were predators, and the scent of iron and adrenaline and hunting instinct was something that prey species could detect even if they did not consciously understand what they were smelling. The 12 Marines behind Vasquez did not help with that impression, because they were all large and heavily armed, and their eyes moved constantly as they scanned for threats, and several of them were smiling in ways that showed their teeth. "Coming," Ambassador Thireen said in a voice that wavered with fear. "We did not know if anyone would hear our signal, and we certainly did not expect help to come from your sector of space." Vasquez kept her voice soft and her movements slow as she replied, explaining that they had picked up the distress call and decided to investigate, and asking what had happened and who had attacked them. Thireen explained about the Crystal Raiders, and the ambush, and the damaged engines, and she told them that the raiders had promised to return in a few days to collect the crew as slaves. "How many raider ships?" Sergeant Cole asked from behind Vasquez, with his deep voice making several of the Valkyrie flinch in fear. 12 ships with approximately 200 warriors total, Thireen answered, while her tendrils flickered with distress. "They are too many for us to fight, and we have no weapons that could hurt them anyway." Cole looked at Vasquez with one eyebrow raised and a grin spreading across his scarred face as he asked if she had heard that. Only 12 ships and maybe 200 targets. The other Marines laughed at his words, and the sound made Theorine's bioluminescence flicker and dim with primal terror. "That is funny to you?" she asked, with confusion and fear mixing in her voice. "Those are impossible odds for any rescue force." Vasquez finally allowed herself to smile as she stepped closer to the trembling ambassador and explained that humans had a different view of odds than most species. "We are not here to defend your ship," she said, with her gray eyes glinting like steel. "We are going to get your people ready to move to our vessel for safety, and then we are going to track those raiders back to wherever they came from." Theorine's large eyes grew even wider as she asked what they planned to do when they found the raider base. "Hunt them," Vasquez answered simply, "every single one of them, until there is nothing left." The ambassador made a sound that might have been a gasp or might have been a whimper as she realized what she was looking at. These humans had not come to rescue the Valkyrie out of kindness or duty or hope for reward, but because the distress signal had told them that there were predators nearby who preyed on the weak, and that was apparently an invitation that humans could not resist. "You are going to attack 200 raiders with only 12 soldiers?" Theorine asked, with disbelief coloring every word. Sergeant Cole laughed again and patted his cybernetic arm with obvious affection as he answered that 12 humans was probably overkill for only 200 prey animals, but better to be safe than sorry. Vasquez watched the fear in the ambassador's eyes slowly change to something else, something that might have been hope or might have been awe, and she knew that this was the moment when the Valkyrie would decide if humans were monsters or saviors. "We will not let them hurt your people," she said in a softer voice. "That is a promise from one predator to the creatures under her protection." Theorine stared at the human commander for a long moment before her tendrils began to glow brighter than they had in days, and she finally understood why the Galactic Council feared humans so much. It was not because humans were violent or aggressive or dangerous, although they were certainly all of those things. It was because when humans decided to protect something, they did not know how to stop, until either they won or they died trying. And looking at the cold determination in Commander Vasquez's eyes, Theorine suspected that these particular humans had never learned how to lose. The Krikstal raider captain called Gorthax led his warriors back to the crippled Valkyrie ship 4 days earlier than promised because he was eager to collect his new slaves and did not see any reason to wait. His 12 ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation around the Serenity's grace, and Gorthax felt his mandibles click together with anticipation as he imagined the fear his prey must be feeling at this very moment. The Valkyrie were perfect slaves because they were weak and obedient, and their bioluminescent bodies were considered beautiful by many wealthy collectors across the galaxy. And Gorthax expected to make a fortune selling this particular group to the highest bidders. "Scan the vessel," he ordered his sensor operator. "I want to know exactly how many are still alive and where they are hiding." The operator's claws moved across the console and then stopped as confusion spread across his armored face. Reported with uncertainty in his voice, "The sensors show life signs aboard the vessel, but they are strange readings that I do not recognize, and there appear to be far fewer of them than we expected." Gorthax dismissed the concern with a wave of his primary claw, because life signs could be disrupted by failing power systems and damaged hulls, and he assumed that some of the Valkyrie had simply died during the 4 days since the attack. "Send boarding parties to all available airlocks," he commanded. "I want this done quickly before they find some way to destroy themselves rather than be taken." Dozens of raiders swarmed from their ships and attached to the Serenity's grace like parasites feeding on a dying host. And Gorthax watched from his command throne with satisfaction as his warriors reported successful entry through multiple access points. The first reports came back exactly as expected, with teams moving through dark corridors and searching for prey. And then the reports stopped. Team 7, report your status, the communications officer called. Team 7, do you copy? There was no response. Gorthax felt his confidence flicker for just a moment, before he pushed the feeling aside and demanded updates from the other teams. But when those updates came, they made his ichor run cold. Captain, a panicked voice screamed through the communicator. There is something on this ship with us, and it is not Velkari. And Trooper Kraft is dead. And I didn't even see what killed him, but his throat was cut, and there was blood everywhere and... The transmission ended in a wet, gurgling sound that Gorthax recognized as the noise a warrior made when something sharp punched through his chest armor. All across the Raider communication network, similar reports began flooding in. Contact at Junction 17. Multiple hostiles. They came from the ceiling. Trooper Vex is down. Trooper Morn is down. Something grabbed Trooper Kell and dragged him into the ventilation shaft. What are these things? I have never seen anything like them. They move like shadows, and they will not stop coming. Gorthax slammed his claw against his throne, in fury and fear, as he demanded to know what was attacking his warriors. The answer came from one of the few teams that had managed to get a clear visual before being overwhelmed. And the image that appeared on his screen made Gorthax feel something he had not felt in over 20 years of raiding. It was fear. The creatures were bipedal with soft pink skin and no armor at all, and they should have been easy prey for any Crystal warrior. But they moved with the terrible patience of apex predators, and their eyes held no fear at all. They were humans. The cursed species from the quarantine zone had somehow found this ship. And now they were doing what humans did best. They were hunting. Vasquez moved through the darkened corridors of the Serenity's Grace like death given human form, and her rifle barked in short, controlled bursts every time a Crystal came within her sights. Sergeant Cole worked beside her with his cybernetic arm punching through armored chitin like it was made of paper, and the other 10 Marines had spread throughout the ship in pairs to create a web of death that no raider could escape. The humans had spent the last 3 days preparing for this moment. They had studied the layout of the ship and identified every choke point and kill zone, and they had placed motion sensors and tripwires and improvised traps in strategic locations throughout the vessel. They had moved the Velkari crew to a secured section and sealed them inside with enough air and food to last for weeks. And then they had shut down all non-essential power to make the ship as dark and cold as possible. And then they had waited. Good at waiting, because that was how their ancestors had hunted for hundreds of thousands of years, following prey across endless distances until the moment came to strike. Now that moment had arrived, and the Crystal Raiders were learning what it meant to be on the wrong end of a persistence predator. Ambassador Thyrene watched everything from a secured monitoring station, her tendrils flickering with horror and awe as she observed the humans systematically destroying the raider force. They did not fight like any species she had ever seen, because they did not form defensive lines or exchange fire from fixed positions, or follow any of the standard combat doctrines used by Council military forces. Instead, they struck from unexpected directions and vanished before the raiders could respond. And they used the screams of fallen enemies as psychological weapons, broadcasting them through the ship's speakers to spread terror and confusion. One human Marine was using a blade instead of a gun, appearing from the shadows behind isolated Crystal and cutting them down before they even knew he was there, and then disappearing again like a ghost. Another pair had found a way into the ventilation system and were dropping down onto enemy patrols from above, killing them in seconds before climbing back up into the darkness. The Crystal were not warriors anymore, because they had become prey, and they knew it. Gorthax watched his force crumble on the tactical display as one by one the signals from his warriors went dark, and he felt the fear growing in his chest until it threatened to overwhelm him. "Pull back!" he screamed into the communicator. "All units return to the ships immediately." But it was already too late, because the humans had anticipated that order. The Marines had worked their way to the airlocks during the fighting, and now they held every escape route, and the retreating Kriegsstahl ran straight into them, into ambushes that cut them down like harvested grain. 4 hours after the boarding action began, it was over. 200 Kriegsstahl raiders were dead, and not a single human had fallen. Commander Vasquez walked through the blood-soaked corridors with her rifle still ready and her eyes still scanning for movement. And when she reached the bridge, she found Sergeant Cole already there with a grin on his face. "The raider fleet is trying to run," he reported, "but their lead ship is powering up weapons and looks like it might try to destroy this vessel out of spite." Vasquez nodded and opened a channel to the Death's Hand, which had been waiting at the edge of the system for exactly this moment. "Take them," she ordered. The human warship came screaming out of the darkness with all weapons blazing, and the 12 raider vessels that had seemed so dangerous just hours ago were suddenly nothing more than targets in a shooting gallery. One, they exploded or surrendered. And when the battle was finally over, only a single raider ship remained intact. Vasquez had ordered her crew to let that one go. She wanted survivors. She wanted them to spread the word about what happened when predators came hunting in human territory. And most of all, she wanted them to tell everyone in the galaxy that Earth's deadliest species had found something worth protecting, and they would never stop hunting those who tried to hurt their new friends. The Galactic Council chamber fell completely silent when Ambassador Theorine finished her official report on the incident at the Serenity's Grace, and for the first time in centuries, every representative in the massive hall had nothing to say. The chamber was a beautiful structure of crystal and light that floated in orbit around the Council homeworld, and it contained representatives from over 3,000 species who had joined together to share knowledge and resources and maintain peace across the galaxy. But peace was a fragile thing, and everyone in the chamber knew that the events of the past week had changed everything. High Chancellor Voss, a tall and ancient being whose species had founded the Council over 10,000 years ago, finally broke the silence with a voice that trembled slightly despite his best efforts to remain calm. "Let me make certain I understand what you are telling us," he said, as his multiple eyes blinked in sequence. "Humans answered your distress call without any promise of reward or any formal alliance with your species." "That is correct," Thyrene answered with her tendrils glowing steady and bright. "They came because we asked for help, and that was the only reason they needed." "And then they destroyed an entire Kriegsstahl raiding force with only 12 soldiers?" "Yes, High Chancellor, though I think destroyed is perhaps too gentle a word for what they did." A murmur ran through the chamber as representatives whispered to each other about what they had just heard, and many of them were looking at the human ambassador who sat quietly in the section reserved for newer species. Ambassador Catherine Chen was a small woman with gray hair and sharp eyes that had seen 2 wars and 3 decades of political combat, and she watched the Council's reaction with a patient expression that revealed nothing of her thoughts. "But that is not the end of your report." Chancellor Voss continued with growing unease. "Please tell the Council what happened after the battle." Thyrene took a deep breath and explained that the humans had not stopped after rescuing her crew and destroying the raider boarding force. They had captured the navigation data from one of the raider ships and used it to locate the main Kriegsstahl base in the Nebula of Thorns, a region of space so dangerous that no Council expedition had ever survived an attempt to map it. The humans had gone there anyway. 3 days after the rescue, Commander Vasquez and the UEN Death's Hand had returned with proof that the Krixtal Raider base was nothing more than debris and ash. And they had brought something else as well. They had rescued over 200 slaves from 17 different species who had been held in the Raider stronghold, some of them for decades. The humans did not just defend themselves or protect us, Thierine said with emotion, making her voice catch. They tracked the predators back to their lair, and they ended the threat permanently. And then they freed every prisoner they could find without asking anything in return. The chamber erupted in chaos as representatives shouted questions and accusations and demands for more information. And Chancellor Voss had to activate the silence field 3 times before order was restored. When the noise finally stopped, a harsh voice cut through the quiet from the section where the more aggressive species sat. It was Ambassador Kreth of the Dominion Hegemony, a military alliance of warrior species who had long opposed any restrictions on conquest and expansion. This is exactly what the Council has always feared, Kreth declared, with anger vibrating through his translated words. The humans are out of control, launching attacks without Council authorization, interfering in regions that are not their concern, and acting as if they have the right to decide who deserves to live and who deserves to die. Ambassador Chen rose slowly from her seat and waited until every eye in the chamber was focused on her before she spoke. The Krixtal were slavers, she said in a voice as cold as deep space. They attacked an innocent research vessel and intended to sell the crew as property. And when we stopped them, we found hundreds of victims from species that have been crying to this council for help for generations. She let that statement hang in the air for a moment before continuing. How many times has the Dominion hegemony proposed action against the Raider cartels? And how many times has this council refused to act because it might upset the balance of power or offend some member state that profits from the slave trade? Kreth's response was cut off by a wave of angry shouts from the representatives of species that had lost citizens to raiders over the years. And Ambassador Chen waited patiently until the noise died down. Humanity has been part of this community for 30 years, she continued, and in that time we have watched this council debate and discuss and delay, while millions of innocent beings suffered at the hands of criminals and conquerors who knew that no one would ever come to stop them. She stepped forward until she was standing in the center of the chamber, with every sensor and every eye locked onto her small form. On Earth, we have a saying that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. And we have decided that we are not going to do nothing anymore. Chancellor Voss leaned forward with concern and asked what exactly the humans intended to do. Ambassador Chen smiled, and several of the more sensitive species in the chamber felt a chill run through their bodies at the sight. We intend to answer distress calls, she said simply. We intend to protect those who cannot protect themselves, and we intend to take off. Make it very clear to every slaver and raider and conqueror in this galaxy that preying on the weak is no longer safe. And if the Council forbids this? Kreth demanded with fury in his voice. Chen's smile widened just a fraction as she answered. The Council can do whatever it wants, but it cannot stop us from being who we are. And we are a species that spent 200,000 years fighting each other because there was nothing else to fight. She looked around the chamber at the thousands of faces watching her, some with fear, and some with hope, and some with anger. Now we have found something better to fight for, and you have no idea how happy that makes us. The silence that followed was absolute. Chancellor Voss finally spoke in a voice that carried the weight of 10,000 years of galactic history. What do you want from this council, Ambassador Chen? Nothing, she replied. We are not asking for permission, support, or approval, and we will do what we believe is right, regardless of what this body decides. She paused, and her expression softened, just slightly. But we would welcome allies who share our values, and we would be honored to stand beside any species that believes the strong should protect the weak rather than prey upon them." She turned and walked back to her seat without waiting for a response, and behind her the chamber exploded into the most intense debate in council history. But Ambassador Thierine was not watching the politicians argue. She was watching the human ambassador, and she was already planning the message she would send to her government, recommending that the Velkhari become the first species to formally ally with Earth. The humans were terrifying, yes, but they were terrifying in exactly the way that the galaxy needed. 5 years had passed since the rescue of the Serenity's Grace, and Ambassador Thierine stood on the observation deck of the UEN Humanity's Promise, watching the stars drift by, as she remembered how much everything had changed. The Humanity's Promise was the flagship of the Guardian Fleet, a massive warship that would have terrified her younger self, but now felt like the safest place in the entire galaxy. Beside her stood Admiral Elena Vasquez, the woman who had once been the commander of a single destroyer, but now led a fleet of over 200 ships crewed by dozens of different species. They had come a long way since that first terrifying meeting on the crippled Velkhari research vessel. "You are quiet today," Vasquez observed, without taking her eyes off the stars. "That usually means you are thinking about something important." Thierine's tendrils flickered with amusement at how well the human had learned to read her body language over the years. "I was thinking about the day we met," she admitted, "and how certain I was that your species would be the death of us all." Vasquez laughed, and the sound no longer made Thierine's instincts scream at her to run. "Most species felt that way about us at first," the Admiral replied, "and honestly, they were not wrong to be afraid, because we are very good at killing things." "But you are also very good at protecting things," Thierine said, with warmth coloring her words, "and that is something I did not understand until I saw it for myself." The galaxy had learned that lesson over the past 5 years, sometimes willingly, and sometimes through painful experience. After the Velkhari became the first species to sign the Guardian Pact with Earth, others had followed quickly. Within the first year, 47 species had joined the alliance, many of them former victims of raiders and slavers who had suffered for generations while the Galactic Council debated and did nothing. The humans had given them something that the Council never had: hope. Hope that someone would actually come when they called for help. Hope that the predators who had terrorized them would finally face consequences. Hope that being weak did not mean being alone. The Guardian Fleet had grown from a handful of human warships into a true galactic force with crews drawn from every member species, and together they had achieved things that the Council had declared impossible. The Krikstal Confederacy had collapsed within 2 years, after the Guardian Fleet hunted down their major bases one by one, and freed every slave they could find. The Devourer hives that had threatened the outer colonies for centuries had retreated to dark space, after a single human battle group destroyed 3 of their invasion fleets. The slave markets of Orion Prime had closed forever, after a Guardian cruiser parked in orbit and broadcast a message that said simply, "You have 1 day to free every slave and surrender every slaver, or we will come down there and do it ourselves." The slavers had believed that no one would actually follow through on such a threat. They had been very wrong, but not every change had been dramatic or violent. The Guardian Pact had also created schools where young members of different species could study together and learn from each other. They had built medical stations that provided free care to anyone who needed it, regardless of their species or wealth. They had established trade routes protected by Guardian patrols where merchants could travel without fear of piracy. Humans had brought their terrible capacity for violence to the galaxy. But they had also brought something else. They had brought the fierce loyalty of pack animals who protected their own at any cost. Admiral, a young Velkari officer called from across the observation deck. We are receiving a priority transmission from the Council homeworld. Vasquez nodded and walked to the communication station, with Thireen following close behind. The face that appeared on the screen belonged to Chancellor Voss, and the ancient being looked more tired than Thireen had ever seen him. Admiral Vasquez, he said with formality barely hiding his exhaustion. The Council has received reports of a crisis in the Serpent's Expanse, and we formally request the assistance of the Guardian Fleet. Thireen felt surprise ripple through her, because this was the first time the Council had ever asked the humans for help. For 5 years, they had criticized and condemned and complained about the Guardian Pact, while secretly being relieved that someone else was dealing with the problems they had ignored for so long. What kind of crisis? Vasquez asked in a professional tone. The Ravager clans have united under a new warlord, explained with fear flickering across his ancient features. They are moving toward the demilitarized zone with a fleet of over 1,000 ships, and the Council Defense Forces cannot stop them. The Ravager clans were an alliance of warrior species from the Galactic Edge who lived for conquest and glory, and they had been a growing threat for decades that the Council had chosen to ignore. How many civilian systems are in their path? Vasquez asked. 47 inhabited worlds, with a combined population of 8 billion beings, Voss answered, and the Council has no ships available to evacuate them in time. Vasquez looked at Thireen with a question in her eyes, and the Velkari ambassador nodded immediately. We will help, Vasquez told the Chancellor. The Guardian Fleet will deploy within 6 hours. Relief flooded across Voss's face as he thanked her, and Thireen noticed that he did not look surprised by the answer. Not surprised. Everyone in the galaxy knew by now what happened when someone called for help and the humans heard them. After the transmission ended, Vasquez stood in silence for a moment before turning to look at Thireen. 1,000 ships is a lot, she admitted, even for us. Are you worried? Thireen asked. The Admiral smiled, and it was the same predator smile that had terrified Thireen 5 years ago. But now it filled her with confidence. No, Vasquez answered. I am excited, because it has been too long since we had a real challenge, and my Marines are getting restless. She turned to look out at the stars, where 47 worlds full of innocent beings were waiting to learn if anyone would come to save them. Tell the fleet to prepare for combat, she ordered, and send a message to the Ravager clans. What message? Thireen asked. Vasquez's smile turned cold and sharp as she answered. Earth remembers its friends, and Earth repays its debts. And if they touch a single civilian before we get there, then we will follow them to the edge of the galaxy and beyond, until every single one of them understands what it means to threaten creatures under human protection. Thireen watched the Admiral stride away to prepare for battle, and she felt the same awe that she had felt 5 years ago when she first realized what humans truly were. They were predators, yes. They were violent and stubborn and terrifying in ways that no other species could match. But they were predators who had chosen to hunt other predators, and that made them exactly what the galaxy needed. The distress signal from the Serenity's Grace had been answered by Earth's deadliest species, and now the whole universe knew what that meant. It meant that the darkness should be afraid. It meant that the cruel and the corrupt had nowhere left to hide. It meant that, when the weak cried out for help, someone would always come. Because humans answered distress calls, they protected their pack, and they never ever stopped hunting those who hurt their friends.